Well, welcome back to the Steve Mack's Muscle Car Show podcast. We are now sponsored by High Octane Classics, the Northeast's largest muscle car and supercar dealership located at 143rd Washington Street in Auburn, Massachusetts, also known as 143 Washington Street in Auburn, Mass. High Octane Classics buys and sells and services muscle cars and exotics. You can call them at 508-859-4515. In this episode of the Steve Mack's Muscle Car Show, we explore the world of Camaro police cars, Chevy's answer to the Ford 427 Thunderbolt, four-wheel steer Camaros, and lots more. It's all right now on the Steve Mack's Muscle Car Show. We're back. This is episode number 2 of the Steve Mack's Muscle Car Show. Let's get it started right now with fact number 14 from my book, Steve Magnanti's 1001 Muscle Car Facts. Here we go. Number 14. Did the California Highway Patrol really employ a fleet of Z28 Camaros for law enforcement duty? Yes, indeed. The year was 1979, and the usual full-size Ford, Chevrolet, and Mopar police sedans had become so underpowered from choking emission controls, a faster platform was needed. As an experiment, Chevrolet provided 12 new 79 Z28s revamped for police duty with 308 gears in place of the stock 342 ratio, Firestone Police Special fabric tires, the standard radials were not speed rated for sustained driving, front bumper guards, and stealthy interior-mounted emergency lights. 4 cars each were allocated to the El Centro Desert region, heavily populated West Los Angeles, freeways of Bakersfield, and mountain passes of Redding. In service, every car experienced at least one failure of its 175 horsepower LM1 350 V8. Though ultimately unsuccessful, this early test opened the door to later police car packages based on 5-liter Mustangs, turbocharged Buick Regals, and yes, more Camaros. Yeah, it's kind of funny. 1979 was the year that all factory-built police cars suffered from catalytic converters, EGR systems, suffocated down, low compression ratios, and basically, the 440 Mopar police cars of 1970 and 71, which had 375 horsepower, were down to 180 net horsepower by 1977-78. Beyond that, the Chevy Big Block, the 454, which was used in police cars in the mid-70s, gone by 1979 with Chevrolet's downsized Impalas. So, the California Highway Patrol, with all those freeways and highways, had to do something to catch speeders who were still trying to get away in those crazier days. And if you couldn't outrun the radio, well, you might just outrun that police car. So again, the Camaros were utilized, and even though those 350 engines in those Z28s weren't up to the task, and again, every one of those engines blew a rod or kicked something, they learned a lot from those. And one thing that was kind of important, really, was the fact that shotguns had to be cut down to fit in these smaller cars. And that's a fact that'll come up a little later on in this book, but had to be cut down to fit in these cars. Now, if you just take a hacksaw and cut down a shotgun, that's pretty illegal. So the CHP was granted permission to modify shotguns for use in these smaller Camaro compartments. And keep in mind, too, these Camaros basically had no back seat. So these were cars that were designed for chasing speeders. The arresting part and apprehending part would have been up to the big Caprice or four-door that would come up later on and take the bad guy off the jail. Chevrolet Camaros were absolutely used as police cars in 1979. It was the beginning of very, very big things. Okay, moving on to fact number 15. Legendary General Motors design vice president Bill Mitchell drew styling influences from varying sources. During an offshore fishing trip to Bimini, he caught a mako shark and had it stuffed and mounted on his office wall. The natural blue to white color fade intrigued Mitchell so much he dictated its application to the XP 755 Corvette Mako Shark 1 concept car of 1961. Unfortunately, after several rejected attempts, the guys in the color department had such a hard time matching the paint fade, they reportedly sneaked into Mitchell's office and had the stuffed shark retouched to match their effort on the car. Though some insiders claim no such trick was played, Mitchell eventually approved the faded paint treatment, exclaiming, "I knew you guys could do it, you just had to work harder." Now, Bill Mitchell was, well, a fearsome guy. He was the head of GM Style, and what he said had to happen. So it's kind of funny to think that if the guys couldn't match it normally, well, the tail wagged the dog, and the guys grabbed his fish off his office wall when he was on a trip to Paris and resprayed the fish to match what they did on the car. And whether it's true or not, it's a great story. Okay, fact number 16. The appearance of several Z11-powered 1964 Chevelles on the Southern Run What You Brung match race circuit fueled rumors that Chevrolet actually ran a number of them down the assembly line. Though such a combination would have been a logical answer to the factory-produced Ford 427 high-riser Fairlane Thunderbolt and Mopar Race Hemi lightweights, no Z11 Chevelles rolled off the assembly line. After March of '63, any General Motors factory race development was strictly forbidden. But that didn't stop privateers such as Malcolm Durham, Dickie Harrell, Maynard Rupp, Burris Hall, and Bill Hahn from piecing together fierce W-motored Chevelles to represent the bow tie in the early match race wars. While some of these hybrids used factory-supplied Z11 crate engines, most were the result of cannibalizations of actual 1963 Z11 Impala lightweights. Now, if you're not familiar with the Z11, that was the highest evolution of the Chevy W engine. Of course, the W engine comes out in '58 as the 348 and in '61 as the 409. But the W series pinnacle was the 1963 Z11. Some were also made in '62, but the Z11 basically was a 427 cubic inch 409 with modified cylinder heads that had a higher port contour and a different two-piece intake manifold. And again, while many people would like to believe that they made some 427 Z11 Chevelles, they never rolled off the assembly line. And once again, in '64, the Thunderbolt 427 Ford and the Race Hemi Mopars were running amok on drag strips all over the country. But again, with Chevrolet's self-imposed racing ban of '63, nope, no Z11 Chevelles were built. Okay, moving on, fact number 17. Bruce Springsteen's blue-collar, tell-it-like-it is musical compositions are a favorite of many, but at times he should have done a little fact-checking. In the song Racing in the Street from the 1978 album Darkness on the Edge of Town, the boss sings, quote, "I got a '69 Chevy with a 396, fuely heads and a hearse on the floor," unquote. I'm not doubting Bruce's skills, but if he figured out a way to adapt 327 small block Corvette heads to a 396 big block, I'd like to know more. I mean, let's face it, okay, the Fuely refers to, well, 1957 through 65, when you can get the Rochester mechanical fuel injection unit on top of the 283, and then in 62 through 65, the 327 small block. Those engines came with what they call Fuely heads, with bigger valves and bigger ports. 1965 brought the 396, which was a big block, a whole different engine family, which was never available with mechanical fuel injection. Instead, they had canted valves and what they call porcupine or semi-hemi cylinder heads. So there's no such thing as a 396 with Fuely heads. Well, Bruce, at least you tried. Moving on to fact number 18. Okay, here we go with... While the heroes of other early 1980s action movies drove Corvettes and Trans Ams, the 1984 cult classic Repo Man featured an unlikely automotive star, a 1964 Chevy Malibu four-door. Piloted by a radiation-sickened missile engineer from New Mexico, its trunk contained the remains of 4 dead space aliens. And don't get me started about space aliens. Seeking a healthy bounty, actors Emilio Estevez, Harry Dean Stanton, and the other Repo Men chased the Chevy throughout Los Angeles. Producer and former member of the 1960s band The Monkees, Michael Nesmith, filled the movie with charmingly random elements and symbolism. For instance, the Chevelle's left-hand turn signal was always flashing. Remember, a Repo Man is always intense. Well, there it is. When I was in college, Repo Man was a big movie. Emilio Estevez and all the other people in that film. Good hardcore punk soundtrack. Dead Milkman, all that kind of stuff. And again, to put a 64 Malibu four-door in that movie as the star car, kind of a weird idea, weird choice. But with that said, every scene you see that car, the left blinker's on, and there's Harry Dean Stanton sick with radiation poisoning, vomiting, his hair's falling out, slumped over the wheel, driving around L.A., and everybody's following this guy. But again, in the trunk of that thing are 4 dead aliens. And there's a scene in that movie that I love. The police pull the guy over and say, "What's in the trunk?" He goes, "Oh, you don't want to look in the trunk." And when they open the trunk, poof, this pile of smoke and 4 boots are left there on the road as he drives off with the left blinker blinking. Great movie, Repo Man. Check it out if you get a chance. All right, fact number 18.
19.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. Okay. Fact number 19. The 1955 Chevy 265 small block wasn't known as a small block until the 1958 arrival of the W Series 348 engine family. That's when comparisons could be drawn and nicknames conjured. Thanks to its compact dimensions, hot rodders began calling the 265 and its immediate 283 and 327 cube successors mouse motors. The term rat wasn't used until after the 1965 debut of the Mark IV 396 engine family. Its logical origin is the answer to the question, what rodent is bigger than a mouse? Other once popular nicknames for the Mark IV big block were semi-hemi, which was a reference to its combustion chamber layout, and porcupine, which is descriptive of how its valve stems exit the head at multiple angles like the quills of a porcupine. None of the terms were used as official marketing slogans by Chevrolet, though in the late 1960s, Chrysler and Edelbrock conspired to create the Rat Roadster, a plenum-style manifold designed to fortify the 426 Hemi for conflict with Chevy big blocks. So there it is. If you bought a 426 Hemi in the late 60s and the street Hemi dual plane wasn't good enough for L88 and tri-power 427s, well, you take that manifold off and get yourself an Edelbrock Rat Roadster for the task of roasting the rat in the other lane. And yeah, rats and mice, those are the terms for the big block and the small block Chevrolet V8 engines. Okay, fact number 20. Was Chevrolet actually working on a four-wheel steering setup for the Gen 3 Camaro? Yes, and I personally saw a functional development mule during a February 1998 visit to the GM Tech Center in Warren, Michigan. The test car was a 1987 IROC Z riding on an Australian-made Borg-Warner rear axle fitted with S10 4x4 front axle steering knuckles and an electric steering rack. Inside, a series of control knobs let test engineers set the rear steering arc and sensitivity. Though a four-wheel steering Camaro never entered series production, the data generated by the test car likely helped production of the optional 2000 through 2004 GM Delphi quadra-steer system for GM and Chevrolet heavy-duty pickup trucks. And you think about a four-wheel steer car, and well, it must have been for inner-city maneuverability. No, the reality was that system was used for high-speed stability. And in fact, the rear tires, the arc that they turned was a matter of 3 or 4 degrees. Because again, if you're going along at 70 or 80 miles per hour and the front and rear tires steer at the same time, a small amount of steering movement or wheel movement at the rear of the car would be enough not to need more than that. So again, I saw that car on my trip to Chevrolet as part of a story I called Beyond the Toy Box. And the sad thing is today, that Z has probably been crushed. My tour guide for that whole thing was a really friendly guy, and he walked us through a bunch of stuff that we weren't really supposed to see. But the photographer, Scott was our photographer. And the sad thing is, that car and most of the other ones, including the twin-engine Citation I talked about on episode number 1, are probably gone by now. While that four-wheel steer IROC Z never materialized, we do know that Honda brought into production, I believe the Prelude had an optional four-wheel steer system that was, again, meant for utilization at higher speeds with minimal tire movement. So Chevrolet was playing with the idea, but again, it never made production. Okay, fact number 21. Now, in my book, it is broken into different sub-chapters. The first one was Legend and Lore. The second is called Body and Interior. And again, this is all about Chevrolets, but there's a lot of Mopar and Ford stuff in here, too. Let's get started. Here is fact number 21. Added instrumentation was an integral part of every Impala Supersport interior, but in 1964, it had to be ordered at extra cost, or you had to settle for the standard idiot lights. For 1965, Chevrolet made oil pressure, amperage, coolant temperature, and engine vacuum gauges standard on every full-sized SS. Automatic transmission Impala Supersports came with a vacuum gauge, but buyers wanting a tachometer could pay an extra $48.45 for the RPO U16 rev counter. Other ways to get the tach without paying extra in 1965 were to specify a 3-speed or a 4-speed manual transmission or any option over 300 horsepower. And again, tachometers, well, they kind of go hand in hand with a sporty image in a sporty car. But the Chevy Super Sport, they were not standard unless you went, again, with the manual transmission in those early days of the Super Sport dynasty. Okay, fact number 22. Front bucket seats were standard equipment in Chevelle Super Sports in 1964 and 65 only. Starting in 1966, Super Sport customers paid an extra $100 for the RPO A51 Strato bucket seats. Today, many original bench seat 1966 through 73 Chevelle Super Sports have been restored and treated to upgraded bucket seats in the process. For 1973, the Chevelle Super Sports final year, the RPO code for the Strato bucket seats changed from A51 to AN7 and cost jumped to $133. And again, a lot of folks will say, any Chevelle with bucket seats is a Super Sport. Not true. You could get the bucket seat option in a 6-cylinder Chevelle if you wanted it. But just because you see the buckets doesn't make the car a Super Sport. Unless you're talking 64 and 65, when they were standard. So it's kind of a minefield, that task of decoding and proving cars at car shows, because between now, 2020, and 1965, 55 years later, so many of these cars have been modified, customized, and then brought back to stock again, or in some cases what people think is correct stock but is not. So you got to watch. The devil is in the details. Okay, going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. Okay, we're back with the Steve Maggs Muscle Car Show. It's picked up with fact number 23. 2 distinct trunk spoiler configurations were available on the Camaro Z28 1970. Number 23. 2 distinct trunk spoiler configurations were available on the Camaro Z28 in 1970. The first one was a one-piece affair manufactured for Chevrolet by A.O. Smith and was standard on all Z28s. Later in the model year, and perhaps with prompting from SCCA Trans Am race teams in search of extra downforce, a much more aggressive 3-piece spoiler was available under COPO 9796. Both spoilers were made of molded plastic. The small spoiler continued as standard equipment for 1971, with the tall ducktail spoiler becoming part of the extra-cost D80 package, which included a front air dam. It's true, if you see 1970 Camaro Z28s and even certain Camaro SS's, Super Sports, you'll see one of 2 possible spoiler configurations. One is that little tiny guy, it's about 1.5 inches tall, one-piece deal. The other one is that ducktail piece, which was probably made and designed with help from the Donahue team, Mark Donahue, who were running Camaros during part of this period. The taller spoiler absolutely took a bigger bite of air and created more downforce on the tail of the Camaro at speeds over 75, 80, 90 miles per hour. And keep in mind, too, a lot of folks see these spoilers on their streetable Camaros and they say, man, that's great at speed. On the highway, it does a lot. Well, the reality is most spoilers don't do anything until about 75 to 110 miles per hour. Above those speeds, when you get at 130, 40 miles per hour, yeah, these spoilers absolutely create downforce, in some cases 150, 200 pounds of downforce. But that 3-piece spoiler became standard on Camaro Z28s after 1972. But if you have a 70 Camaro, well, you really need, but if you have a 70 Z28, you really need to find pictures of it when it was new to determine which spoiler came on it from the factory. It could have been one of 2. Okay, fact number 24. Nearly a decade after Corvette debuted, America's first mass-produced fiberglass body, Chevrolet pioneered the domestic use of another exotic body material with the August 1962 introduction of the RPO Z11 Lightweight 409 package. Introduced for use in NHRA factory experimental drag racing, Z11-equipped Impalas and Bel Airs featured fenders and hoods stamped from 26-gauge aluminum. The cars also had hotter cams, better heads, 2-piece intake manifolds. Though a mere 7 Z11 vehicles were produced in 1962, plus several over-the-counter upgrade kits for steel cars, It set the stage for a larger run of 57 factory-assembled Z11 cars in 1963. And that RPO Z11 is legendary in the world of factory superstock vehicles and pretty much represents the pinnacle of Chevrolet full-sized Impala and Bel Air drag race options. The Z11, again, that aluminum front fender and hood option and bumper shed about 75 pounds off the nose of the car. And we all know that weight off the front of the car is weight that doesn't have to transfer toward the rear of the car on acceleration. And beyond that, if you take 100 pounds out of a typical car on the drag strip, that's like a tenth of a second advantage at the other end of the track. And we all know that if two cars are racing each other and one car is a tenth of a second quicker, that's a car length at the other end of the track. So by pulling 75 pounds out of the nose with the Z11 aluminum nose package, the car was roughly two-thirds or half a car quicker than a steel Impala or 409 powered Bel Air. Now you know. Okay, fact number 25. After several years of sharing a basic flat hood with conventional full-size Chevy models, the Impala Supersport got its own muscle car hood in 1967, but only when the RPO Z24 SS427 package was ordered. The new hood featured a raised central bulge for a non-functional vent. Non-Z24 Impala Supersports, which could be had with anything from the 250 cube six-cylinder engine to big block 396s, continued with the standard flat Impala hood. Only 2,124 Z24 SS427 Impalas were built in 1967, though the Z24 moniker appeared in 1986 on the front-wheel drive Cavalier Z24, some of which may have been made with metal recycled from junked 1967 Impalas. I joke with that a little bit, but it is a fact that when the Z24 moniker came back on the Cavalier in 1986, a lot of folks thought that was the first use of it. But no, way back in the mid-60s, Z24 meant 427 Impala. And also, a lot of folks don't realize that when it comes to Supersport, the Impala could be had with a six-cylinder engine. That's a fact. All right, fact number 26. Hardcore performance enthusiasts seeking minimal distractions were offered RPO UL5 radio delete during the muscle car years. A close inspection of most UL5 cars reveals the presence of speaker and receiver leads built into the wiring harness because making pared down under-dash bundles wasn't cost-effective. UL5 equipped Corvettes lacked the distinctive stainless steel ignition shield panels cloaking the distributor and ignition wires seen on radio-equipped cars. The shielding was needed to prevent ignition noise from reaching the antenna, as the Corvette's fiberglass body lacked the natural barrier afforded by steel body panels. And radio delete equipment, you go back into the 1920s when car radios first became available from car makers. Early antennas were actually wire mesh, quite often woven into the roof of the car, the fabric roof, or in some cases the antenna was also found underneath the running boards. But as you get into the 1930s and 40s, so many people ordered radios from the factory that the dashboards were pre-stamped with the holes for the radios, and when those few people that didn't want a radio ordered radio delete, they came with a metal plate over the hole in the dashboard and going to the outside of the car. But by the 1950s, so many people ordered factory radio equipment that the dashboards came pre-stamped from the car maker with the holes for the receiver. But if you didn't get the radio, you got a metal plate that went over the hole. Now on the outside of the car, the external fender-mounted antenna, often that hole would be either not stamped in some situations, or the hole that was stamped for the radio antenna would be covered with a metal button. Now you know. And that's the story of the RPO UL5 radio delete package. Fact number 27. In the March 1962 issue of Motor Trend, a crazy 327 fuel-injected Chevy 2 was road tested. In that car was a 200-mile-an-hour speedometer. You got to wonder, why did they do that? Could the car really go 200 miles an hour? Well, the fact is, that car was actually built with a 308 rear axle and rode on 650 13 tires. So the reality is, the actual top speed of that car was maybe 140 miles per hour. A little bit of research indicates the speedometer in that car was an export item that measured in kilometers per hour. and 200 kilometers per hour is roughly 120 miles per hour. I would bet the engineers who put that car together probably were having a little bit of fun with this speedometer. They rated the foreign car parts bin, got a metric speedometer, and put it in place of the standard one. Fact 28. All second-generation Camaros built between 1970 and 1981 were built with manual windows until late 1973 when RPO A31 power windows were added to the option list. But there's a rub. Because second-generation Camaro interior designers positioned the power window control switches on the center console and not on the door panels as in first-generation Camaros, power windows were only available on Camaros built with the D55 center console. Thus, buyers of non-console Camaros hand-cranked their windows on hot days. So it's kind of funny. It's not often that engineers will design a situation where you had to have one option to get the next, but it's true. If you didn't order a console in your 73 up Camaro, there was nowhere for those power window buttons to go. Fact 29. 1973 saw the arrival of a sporty four-spoke plastic-covered steering wheel on all Camaro models and as an option on Chevelle and Nova. By 1976, this wheel was also standard on Corvette. Though more attractive than the base 1970 to 72 Camaro steering wheel with its bulky horizontal horn pad, the four-speak design was stigmatized by its installation on the compact Chevy Vega. Corvette owners in particular didn't like being reminded of this fact. It's true, if you take a peek inside of a Chevette, you'll see this funky, four-spoke steering wheel. Hard plastic, looks like soft vinyl, but it's actually rock-hard plastic. But it's the same steering wheel you'll find in certain Camaros and Corvettes. So, if you drove a Corvette or a Camaro, you didn't want to look inside of a Chevette because it had the same steering wheel. There is one difference, though. The diameter of the steering wheel in Corvette was slightly smaller than the one in the Chevette. That's it for this episode of the Steve Maggs Muscle Car Show. We'll be back with an all-new episode next Monday. If you have any questions, go to stevemags.com and hit the mailbag. And be sure to share this podcast with your friends. See you next time. Hasta mañana. The Steve Maggs Muscle Car Show podcast is brought to you by High Octane Classics, the Northeast's largest muscle car and supercar dealership, located at 143 Washington Street in Auburn, Massachusetts. High Octane Classics buys and sells and services muscle cars and exotics. Call them at 508-859-4515.